David, David, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for hosting this discussion. As always, DOE's partnership with NASEO is such a critical part of how we create impact with all of our programs together. And for me, always does feel like coming home to other state energy officials and the leadership that you all are doing in your states, in your programs across the country. As David said, this national blueprint for decarbonizing buildings has been something I've mentioned at a few NASEO meetings over the last 2.5 years. It's been a robust conversation to date, and the conversation's not stopping. The goal of today is to give another update to all of you of what we've done to date with our analysis and our stakeholder engagement, and to really have that much more of an energized discussion of where we need to go next. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? How do we use this as a catalyst to accelerate action across all of our portfolios? And how can we be a more effective partner and resource to all of you? I say around 2.5 years ago, roughly then, our initial conversation started with several of you. We started with meeting with the leading states, some leading cities who had been working on building decarbonization roadmaps and plans. We didn't need to create a new strategy or new conversation on a blank sheet of paper. You all have been leading in this space for a long time. We also were able to, make the most of this rich resource and this rich partnership we have with DOE's national labs. Our two leading authors came from two different national labs. Look about, all of one government, all of one team. We had both the best from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and the National Renewable Energy Lab working together, bringing thoughts from the market, comparisons from international work, and from, again, many states to help us bring together what is the first comprehensive strategy for the federal government about our nation's building stock, from achieving our energy goals, our climate goals. But as you'll hear from Jared, this was a people-centered strategy, one focused on not just the energy and emissions from our nation's building, but the people who live, work, pray, sleep, raise their families in those buildings across our country. And that meant a focus on affordability, that meant a focus on resilience, and a focus on equity. Again, common themes that we hear across the wonderful NASEO convenings and conferences and your working group, as well as priorities we heard from all of you. If this blueprint is going to be useful to structure our national goals, to structure our federal investment priorities, we needed to be responsive to what were the priorities you were all facing in your states and in your communities. So you'll see that that's an explicit part of the strategy from the initial framework that Jared will walk you through. In addition, I wanted to really emphasize how soon 2050 is. It can be a humbling process to be looking at working backwards from achieving these goals in 2050, and how critical the next decade is for this work, for the priorities that we've identified in this blueprint, really an action plan of what needs to happen decade by decade. And in that, I just want to uplift how important your work is, and how important this next decade is from an R&D perspective, market transformation, policy work, making the most of the historic investments of the IRA and bill, as well as the ongoing investments from your states, from local governments, from utility programs, to set us up for success for the rest of our journey between now and 2050. I also want to emphasize that this journey created almost just as many questions for all of us of what we needed to know more to be able to act, as much as it created new frameworks and new answers. So the blueprint and our research priorities going forward. We've heard from you that we need to make the building sector more approachable from a segment analysis perspective. Often people oversimplify it or say it's so complicated that we don't know where to start. And we can have a data-driven, analytically sound middle ground. And that's one that many of you have developed in your own states. And it's one that we've been working on from a national perspective, so that we can map out those pathways to achieve our energy, climate, as well as equity and affordability goals in different building segments across different parts of the country. Another key theme that I would kick off is how important of our nation's commercial buildings, 3/4 of our residential buildings will still be here in 2050. The problems of 2050 are challenges of today in today's building stock. And that means a radically different perspective on our research portfolio. It's not just about new construction. New construction continues to be an important priority, but it is about harnessing the full power of American innovation to looking at our existing buildings and looking at our existing buildings in overburdened and underserved communities. And you heard that from us in our recent Earthshot announcement last fall around affordable home energy shot, as well as in the R&D priorities that Jared will be sharing. So much more to come, but the goal for us in the conversation today and the ongoing conversation is that we need to have constant iterative feedback loops with all of you to make sure that our strategy work, our analysis work, our research and development investments, and our investments across the federal government are meeting your needs and are helping unlock the kind of rapid change that we're all working for. So keep the discussions coming. We're so grateful to the close collaboration with David and his team. We see the partnership with NASEO as one of the most important pillars in our ability to be successful in our conversations about buildings. And I'll also say, I can speak for DOE that we would say the same thing for our transportation decarbonization blueprint. The next round we're doing right now on our industrial decarbonization work on pathways to near zero emissions across our country and on our clean electricity strategy. So know that DOE wants to continue those robust conversations and are so grateful again for NASEO's leadership across each of those sectors and the robust partnerships with all parts of DOE. So with that, I will hand it to Jared, who will get into the substance of the matter to help set the stage for our panel discussion later. Thank you again for hosting us.
Great, thanks so much, Carolyn. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I think so. There we go.
Got it? Okay, great. So yeah, thanks so much, Carolyn. I'm Jared Langevin. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and with Eric Wilson of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and under Carolyn's leadership, we are the National Buildings Decarbonization Blueprint. And so I want to start just by saying, echoing what Carolyn was saying, so by saying thank you. So thanks to all of you at the states and at the state level, working on state level policy, for all the work that you've done on your own strategies, because as Carolyn said, that was really a lot of the raw material for where we went with this federally focused strategy. And so we hope that this content provides some clarity about how the federal government can lead on building decarbonization, but also that this really works together with those existing strategies that you have, and that it bolsters your efforts at the state level on building decarbonization. So we'll start just by highlighting the innovations in this blueprint. And so I think one of the biggest ones is that for the first time, we're setting national goals for building sector decarbonization that we think are consistent with economy-wide U.S. climate goals. And so this is really telling us where we need to go from a federal perspective. So the blueprint is also laying out kind of how we get there in unprecedented amounts of detail. And the focus is really on federal action. So what federal actions and implementation tools are going to spur the change we need, and how can those actions be coordinated across federal agencies? And then, as I mentioned, we also recognize, how important state and local partners are advancing the vision here. So the blueprint outlines many actions from the sub-federal stakeholders' perspective that the federal government can support. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is as Carolyn mentioned, this is a people-centered vision. So this focuses very much on how we can use building decarbonization to unlock all benefits that are on the table to people and communities. And we list several of those at right there. So I think it's critical to underscore that buildings, more so perhaps than any other sector, can have these really direct positive impacts on communities beyond just their role in climate mitigation. And so if we take a step back and look at the motivation for developing the blueprint in the first place, we started with the national climate mitigation goals that the Biden administration set, and these covered the entire U.S. economy. So probably very familiar with these by now. Deep reductions in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, net zero emissions economy wide by 2050. The linchpin of that is 100% clean electric grid is 100% clean electric grid by 2035. And then in terms of people and communities, 40% of the benefits of federal climate and clean energy investment are targeted to flow to disadvantaged communities. So all of our content is really flowing from this starting framework. Why the building sector would be an important focus for achieving those economy-wide climate goals was kind of an important focus for us early on. And so, first is the most obvious reason, which is that buildings are responsible for more than a third of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in our estimation. So there's no way to get to net zero without addressing building sector emissions aggressively. But going well beyond that, as you can see on the right here, there is a critical connection between buildings and people and communities. Buildings matter very immensely to our everyday lives. All of our experience, or almost all of our experiences in buildings, they can dictate our health, our energy bills, affordability challenges, their source of jobs. And the quality of the built environment determines community level exposure to burdens as well. Whether those be economic or burdens related to weather, for example. From a technical perspective, the building stock today is really energy intensive, and we know that a lot of the energy that we use to operate buildings is wasted. So there are big opportunities for energy reductions. That's a problem that's definitely not going to go away by 2050 because the building stock turns over very slowly. And so retrofits of buildings are a very important part of this strategy. And then thinking about the power grid, right now, buildings consume about 3/4 of U.S. electricity, and building end uses like heating and cooling are driving our electric peaks in electricity demand. So what happens with building energy use really has strong implications for our ability to decarbonize the power sector, and that's something we tried to communicate in this strategy as well. And then relatedly, we can talk about buildings as a resource at the grid edge. So we define the grid edge as that last mile of utility distribution networks and behind the meter infrastructure that is closest to utility customers. And so how we manage technologies like on-site solar, battery storage, electric vehicles, and flexible loads together, all of which intersect at buildings, that has really important implications for the cost and difficulty of operating the power distribution grid going forward. So with all that motivation in mind, the blueprint lays out a vision for this kind of broadly beneficial decarbonization trajectory for U.S. buildings between now and 2050. So the overall goal here is to reduce U.S. building greenhouse gas emissions 65% by 2035 and 90% by 2050 versus 2005 levels, while enabling net zero emissions economy-wide and centering equity and benefits to communities. So underneath those, the overall emissions reduction objective there sits these 4 strategic objectives. So first and foremost, we emphasize the need to increase building efficiency, building energy efficiency, to reduce building energy demand, while making sure that we can deliver energy bill savings and strengthen building resilience on the customer side. And then second, we need to accelerate on-site emissions reductions by electrifying space and water heating and reducing fugitive equipment refrigerant emissions. Third, we need to enable 100% clean electricity by 2035, so supporting that administration target by transforming the grid edge at buildings. So that means increasing building demand flexibility potential. It means integrating efficiency, flexibility, and other distributed energy resources like solar and storage. And through doing that, we can substantially reduce the scale and the cost of electric infrastructure that's needed for this 100% clean electricity system. Then the last strategic objective is to minimize embodied life cycle emissions from the construction of every new building and renovation. So thinking outside just the operational emissions perspective. And then on top of those strategic objectives sit these 3 cross-cutting goals. So, and these are goals that we put in there to ensure that any pathway that we find here to achieving these strategic objectives is viewed through the lenses of equity, affordability, and resilience. So what that means is, using building decarbonization solutions and their deployment to advance energy justice and benefits to disadvantaged communities, It means that we have to ensure that as we decarbonize buildings, we reduce energy burdens, we reduce technology costs or keep them affordable. And then we also have to make sure that building decarbonization solutions are able to leave communities better able to withstand and recover from both natural and human caused stresses. So we think that if we do get there on those goals for the blueprint, that we can expect to see a wide array of benefits from doing so. So this again starts with people. So from the kind of people-centric perspective, there are certainly additional jobs on the table. We can expect, up to over $1 trillion investment in clean energy technologies just to reach this vision. There's economic security, right? So with energy efficiency, we can generate over $100 billion in consumer energy cost reductions. There's health benefits, so tens of billions of dollars in avoided public health costs per year that we estimate from reducing on-site combustion in homes and businesses. And then there's, certainly this focus on equity and resilience, and again, ensuring that benefits accrue to disadvantaged communities and that we're able to withstand these growing stresses from weather, from human-caused events and disruptions. And then, looking to the other sectors, buildings are really this critical intersection across sectors, right? So this pathway can deliver, or the pathways that we may need to get to this vision can deliver up to, we think, more than $100 billion in avoided power system costs as the grid decarbonizes, and then can also support grid decarbonization by enabling and optimizing interactive behind-the-meter distributed energy resources. To transportation, right? Building codes, building zoning and planning that encourage high-density developments can reduce transport emissions. And then this focus on life cycle reductions of building emissions is going to create markets for low embodied carbon material manufacturing in the industrial sector, and aiding the decarbonization of the industrial sector is on the table there as well. So this is a much broader story than just the reduction in building greenhouse gas emissions. This is really about benefits that can touch every home and business in the country, while also enabling the decarbonization of every other sector of our economy. And so we want to emphasize that the blueprint is not just a vision. It's also very much focused on how we actually achieve the vision. And so we start a survey of solutions that we have at our disposal in the building sector. So the building sector is quite diverse in terms of the solutions that are on the table for decarbonization. And so what we tried to do here is just kind of put them on the same plane, so we could consider them both in isolation and together, and compare across solutions. And we identified in the blueprint 5 types of these solutions, and you can see those listed in the column of this table. Each of those is mapped to one or more segments of building emissions that it can affect. And those are the rows of this table. And then in the icons of this table, we provided some kind of qualitative communication of the potential magnitude of emissions reduction impacts for each solution here. And so I invite you to look in the blueprint itself in more detail at how we describe these solutions. But in general, again, this is really just about establishing that framework for considering those solutions on the same plane in what is a very heterogeneous sector in buildings here. So many of these solutions that were just kind of mentioned at the table there are already on the market. There are products that we know can have impact, and yet we know they're not being deployed at the scale and speed that's necessary to meet the blueprint's ambitious goals for building decarbonization. And so we think that accelerating that deployment is going to require strong federal action that's really unprecedented in its speed and scale. And we bucket progress on that action into stages that 3 stages that unfold over the next three decades. So right now we're embarking on the most important and challenging of those phases, those stages, which is to catalyze the transition. So before 2030, we need to see strong acceleration in historical progress on emissions reductions for the building sector to really set up the progress that we're going to see in these later stages that we envision in the blueprint. And so doing that, so catalyzing that progress is really going to take unprecedented coordination across federal agencies to achieve. And so you can see on the right that there are kind of a wide range of actions that would fall under this notion of what we need to coordinate at the federal level. So it's advancing leading edge technology performance and affordability via R&D. It's deploying more by developing markets and providing additional funding and financing. And then it's locking in cost-effective performance gains via codes and standards. So in the blueprint itself, we highlight several specific actions that each agency can take via existing authority at their disposal. And we also set down specific milestones for what needs to happen in the next decade in order for us to set up these kind of later stages of the transition, where we're adapting and scaling our activities for broader impacts, and then working to make sure that we address all markets and complete the transition in the later stages of that transition, the kind of 2040 to 2050 range. And so any plan for federal action on building decarbonization has to address the critical work that sub-federal actors are doing and have been doing for years. And so that's, what all of you are working on at the state level. It's what tribes and local governments are doing as well. And in many ways, again, the strategies that you've worked on have really provided inspiration for many of the federal strategies you'll find in the blueprint. And so the blueprint dedicates a section on how this plan for federal action is going to support these state, local, and tribal strategies for building decarbonization. So on this slide on the left, we list several examples of those critical actions to decarbonize the building sector that are really in the state, local, and tribal purview. So a few of those, just to highlight, include leading program implementation for many of the programs in the IRA and bill legislation at the federal level, overseeing utility programs that can access funds for efficiency programs, for demand response programs, enabling innovative financing schemes like on-bill financing. States and localities are also where we enact and enforce building codes and standards, and there also there may also be opportunities to consider additional appliance standards and product procurement standards that can work with the federal standards as well. State public utility commissions can drive innovative reforms to utility planning and can set standards for energy efficiency and clean heat. And then states and localities can change zoning laws to encourage lower carbon development. So the federal government has plenty of tools that can support these kinds of actions at the sub-federal level, and we list several of them in the blueprint. They include things like technical assistance to state utilities and local jurisdictions, model code development that DOE has weighed in on for years, so funding assistance for codes and standards adoption and enforcement as well, and then leading by example through federal building and procurement standards. As well as research on topics such as land use policy that can support zoning approaches. So again, we're positioning here this federal plan as being complementary to what we know is already happening at the sub-federal levels, and showing in many cases here how these federal tools can support those state, local, and tribal actions. So I'll close just by emphasizing that the blueprint is a starting point for further action. We consider it a living framework and one that we hope can be adapted over time to remain relevant. There are a couple of important avenues for doing that, including meetings like this one, conferences, regular webinars, working groups, and we look to engage in all of those. We have a landing page, which I'll mention on the next slide, that will provide other resources and ways of engaging the blueprint. And then Catherine Kaplan would be the contact to highlight here, to reach out to if you have interest in working with us further on this. So with that, I'll just put up the link to the blueprint itself if you haven't already seen it. And thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jared. That was a really super presentation on the blueprint. And I thank both you and your colleague, Eric Wilson, for all the work you did in bringing this together. I particularly like the phased approach discussion. That reminded me when I had read it, I immediately went to, that's one way we can go about our work at NASEO and working with states to help break this down. And maybe the context you offered, Carolyn, I thought of that middle ground and innovation that we can, in fact, get this done. There are pathways here. It's not easy, but neither is it overwhelming, and we can do that. So we thank you both. And with that, we're going to transition into the next part of our discussion among the panel members. And we have Dr. Snyder joining this panel as well, along with two state energy leaders, Julie Stavelin, Michigan Department of Environment and Great Lakes, the Energy Director in Michigan, and an NASEO board member, and Dr. Nick Berger with the DC Department of Energy and Environment, and also a NASEO board member. And thank them both for joining us today. They have a lot of expertise to offer, and this panel is a little different than most. I'm going to step back from my moderating role, and our panel members are going to ask one another some questions, and then maybe I'll add something at the end and open it up to our audience then. But I think we're starting with Carolyn first to kick us off with a question for the panelists.
Thanks, David. I love experimenting with new versions of virtual armchair chats. Julie and Nick, thank you so much for being part of this discussion. So I love the first question here, which is, which of your states or districts building decarbonization efforts are you most excited about, and are great prompts to share with the group today?
Julie, you want to get us going?
Nick, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
I think here in Michigan, one of ours is through our community energy management program, which kind of aligns with the work that we're doing for the home energy rebate program. It lined up really nicely. So, prior to the stimulus funding, which gave us a large influx of funding that allowed us to expand our programs, we were just operating on our normal state energy program allocation. And so we had a small pot of funding that we really just wanted to meet communities where they were at on their energy journey, right? Some of them weren't quite ready to adopt solar or, go fully renewable. So we really wanted to just provide them with the education, information, and tools to understand what that journey is in energy management and help them become energy efficient so they could then make that transition to renewable energy. So this is working with a lot of our small towns that didn't have, sustainability director, somebody who could champion this, right? It's the city manager or the town clerk, right, who's wearing a bunch of different hats. And this funding allowed them to make energy a priority. So we created a grant program that didn't require any match, right? And we really simplified it and streamlined it to make it as easy as possible so that these communities could make an actual progress towards their energy efficiency and renewable energy goals. We did a whole webinar series that kind of outlined the process so that if they were coming in and they had no idea what it meant to manage the energy for the municipality, that they could follow this webinar series. It was free, it was available online, it was broken down into 1 hour time chunks so that they could really take, an interest in moving their community forward. And we've just continued to do that year over year. And now with the stimulus funding that's been available, we're really able to make a bigger difference and award larger projects in more communities across the state. So this is allowing our communities to lead by example for our residents, right? And really pass those savings along to their residents. And now these communities are our champions as we're talking about home energy rebates as they're coming out. So they can advocate to their residents to take advantage of this program and help us identify those residents in their communities that need this the most or that are going to be, the ones that are going to be able to take advantage of these programs.
Thanks, Julie. That was great. In the district, one of the things, so Jared showed that pie chart that breaks down, greenhouse gas emissions across all the different sectors. And one of the things that's, I think, interesting about the district is that our pie chart looks really different. So ours is 3/4 or so of that pie is all buildings. So when we're talking about buildings, it's a good topic for us, which is probably why we're here. But it also puts a lot of pressure on us to think about how we as we think about decarbonizing, how do we blend sort of electrification in our buildings along with energy efficiency? And for us, that's really important. Not that it's not for anyone else, but it's really important because we think a lot about energy burden. So we have obviously a huge focus on the low-income population of the district, and we know that they are, like most low-income households in the United States, overburdened by energy costs. And so as we transition to this all-electric future in the district, we want to think about how do we do that in the way that at least leaves households as good as they were before and ideally makes them better off. So that blending is a big goal, but I would say that it comes with its challenges, right? So one thing is, how do we think about coordinating across programs? So we spend a lot of time as state energy offices talking about how do we
combine, stack, braid, whatever term you want to use, the IRA rebates money with other programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program, local programs that we run, other federal programs. And I think for us, it's thinking about how do we strike the right balance between maximizing the resources that are available, but also minimizing the administrative burden, particularly on households. So if we can effectively on our end make it seamless for a household to get a federal rebate dollar and a weatherization dollar, that's great. If we can't do that, I think it's on us to make sure that we're finding ways to do that energy efficiency work using other types of programs and not sort of adding to the application burden. And then part of that is, again, thinking about the order of operation. So as we blend electrification with efficiency, we know that the best electrification is done in the context of the most efficient structure. And that means going in and doing efficiency first and then sizing systems appropriately. That's the ideal. Is it always going to work? I don't know. So we're trying to think about how do we sort of think ahead. And as we go to do electrification, can we anticipate what's going to be feasible in terms of energy efficiency? So that topic of efficiency and electrification together is probably one of the things I'm most excited about. I'll mention two others quickly. One is the idea of retro-commissioning our buildings. So rather than going in and making major improvements to their technology, looking at how we can save energy by making the technology they have work in the way that it's supposed to. That's particularly important for us as we start to think about how do we decarbonize and improve the efficiency of smaller buildings. So we have a building energy performance standards program in the district. It's our BPS program. And it focuses on large buildings, but we're sort of looking out a couple of cycles into the future and recognizing that the population of smaller buildings is much larger. And the kinds of improvements that a larger commercial building can take on are going to be different than what, a smaller building, a church or a community center, for example, can take on. And then lastly, I think moving to focus more on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, not just exclusively energy savings, and especially through that BEPS program that I mentioned, and moving to a greenhouse gas-based standard for that program. So those are three things that we spend a lot of our time and energy on that reflect our level of excitement.
I think the next question is mine. So what do you see as the biggest need or gap for your district, Nick, and to help you meet your decarbonization goals?
Yeah, here I'll throw out a few that I think are high priorities for us. So one is steady local funding. We are fortunate in the district to have our essentially our legislature, our district council, and our mayor's office focused on finding local resources to support the abundant federal resources. And our plans for decarbonization for our buildings really rely heavily on pairing up those state and local funds. And so making sure that we have steady local sources of funding and thinking about how do we bring year-on-year funding to projects that might take 18 months to build. So it's a very wonky local government problem, I guess. But when you've got a budget that spans a single fiscal year and you've got to go put a big chiller replacement project into a huge building and that project takes 18 months, those timelines don't line up. So that funding piece is really important for us. Different, but also important is the challenge of having a qualified workforce at scale. I think we collectively need to ensure that we are delivering really high quality electrification work. We're going to be judged, not just by the emissions we reduce, but by the households and their views of the programs that we're giving them and the technology that we're installing in their homes. And I do worry that we don't have the people we need in the district, not just the number of people, but really the people who know how to do the kind of work, who know how to install a heat pump so that it performs, as we all know it can, reliably in the climate that the district has. So that workforce piece is really a challenge. And I think that goes both for the programs that we're running, but also I think we have an important role in helping the public at large kind of find and access that high quality contracting population. And then the last thing I'll mention is about communicating really the need and more importantly, like the benefits of electrification and decarbonization to a whole host of stakeholders. including a bunch of stakeholders whose eyes glaze over when we use the word decarbonization, right? So how do we talk about the benefits? How do we talk about the health benefits? The reduction in childhood asthma, indoor air quality improvements, more reliable water heating. You know, your water heater is not going to go out, or your air conditioner is not going to go on the fritz. Like, those are meaningful things to households, and we have to figure out how to communicate them effectively. So those are some of the biggest needs or gaps I think that we're working through right now.
I would say ditto to that too for Michigan. I mean, it's local funding, right? Because the funding that's come through the different stimulus packages, IRA and IIJA, it's not going to last forever. So how can we sustain that? Because the funding's not enough. I mean, our home energy rebate, I think, combined is only going to be able to work on like 1% of our housing stock, right? So finding that local input. So we found some success working with, again, local governments and some of our local utilities who are also investing in that housing stock and in those buildings. And then workforce, right? It's the workforce to get the work done. And then once we have that workforce trained up, what is their continued work, right? After the installations and all that work is done, how do we continue to make sure that they have an active career path that's going to continue on past all of these decarbonization goals?
Okay, my turn. Carolyn, I guess I'll start with you. Can you describe some of the ways that you've engaged stakeholders to help improve the work that you all are doing at the Department of Energy, and what are your plans to do this further?
Thanks. Well, we're already getting great new ideas just from this panel discussion, and really good to, it's so valuable to hear the prioritization that you're facing, both in DC and in Michigan. I'm sure it resonates with many of the states on the call today. So in addition to doing targeted outreach like this webinar today, and bringing up these discussions in a variety of different existing conferences and venues, we're going to be launching a webinar series to go deeper in different elements, and to get much more robust discussion really focused on some of the different barriers and different segments. And then, as I said, we're going to be rolling out a new analysis in the coming months. And as part of that, really wanting to get robust engagement to understand what are the challenges you're seeing in achieving your goals in each of the building segments, and what are the major barriers and what are the opportunities to address them. The question about workforce came up in the chat just, I think, Nick, as you were about to talk about that, and Julie emphasized that. But we can touch workforce in so many different parts along this life cycle as one example, right? And the manufacturing and the installation and the maintenance and the decommissioning. And so how can we be more surgical in our investments as we're trying to address some of the key barriers faced? So those are some of the areas, but really don't be shy. Catherine put her email in the chat, other ways that we can meaningfully engage in your states. With there's many different fora that you all convene regionally within your states, across industry, in addition to your leadership with NASEO. Let us know how we can be more effective. We really, really welcome the feedback. Julie, any insights to share from your work on bringing stakeholders together to get feedback?
I think the thing that we have found most successful is actually meeting on an agenda just for a quick 5-minute pitch, so then they can come and see more information from us. And then really trying to provide the resources and information in multiple formats, right? So they can come in person, or they can get it online, or, we can have a quick, conversation, just trying to really meet them where they're at.
So I'll jump in with the next question. Jared showed some of our reflections that we developed through the blueprint around how we can be better partners, how the federal government can better support you in your priorities in your work, and how can we just be a better collaborative partner across the different priorities you've both outlined. you already teased several, Julie and Nick, as we've gone, but love to hear additional reflections you have.
I can go
think-
first. Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick. No, go ahead. I went first last time. It's your turn.
Okay. All right. We'll trade off. Yeah, that's a really good question, Carolyn. So despite in my first two answers rattling off like half a dozen things, I think I'll focus on one here because I actually think it's really important. And that is, I would love to see the federal government more involved in sort of demonstration projects for deploying the kinds of decarbonization and electrification technologies. I mean, obviously, I'd love to see it in our jurisdiction. I'm sure Julie would love to see them in her jurisdiction, as would everyone else. But and it's not even so much about it's not an issue truly of like like bringing more money to the district, although that's always good. I think what it's really about for me is overcoming the like psychic barriers to all the work that we're talking about. So we spend a lot of our time talking with, again, all those stakeholders that I alluded to earlier, whether they're building owners, they're district council members, they're people in other parts of the government. And, you know, this stuff is new. And that means it's hard and it's often confusing. And I think people tend to default to, this is going to be expensive. We can't do this. And we all of us who work in this space know that there are amazing new technologies, some of which are very well proven, but some of which are coming online every day. And I think it's really essential that we show in real buildings, and I will say boring buildings, right? It's great to renovate a brutalist hotel in Connecticut to a passive house. That's awesome. I would love to stay in that hotel. But that doesn't, I think, help me convince the owner of a Class B office building in the District of Columbia that is feasible for them, even though I know it is. So I would love to see if there are ways where we can partner with the federal government to bring the resources the government has, both monetary and smarts, to show like projects and how they can actually work and sort of go from start to finish, and then be able to like, look, let's go on a tour of this building so you can see, you know, the windows, the AC system, the water heaters, all of it, all working together and all actually achieving the kinds of energy savings that we know to be possible. So that's my pitch.
Yeah, and I think, Nick, you kind of mentioned it earlier, right? It's hard to prioritize the lofty goals of decarbonization when they are trying to balance their budget. So being able to really connect the action with the savings, right? And the long-term savings for that, right? We see this a lot in terms of like our code upgrades, right? We all know that if you renovate or if you're building, right, if you do it to a higher efficiency code, then you're going to save money long-term in terms of the energy use of that building. But that's not what the Home Builders Association is seeing. They're saying, well, it costs me more money to build, and then there's, you know, so helping us figure out how to navigate that messaging and get those, you know, that are on the fence and comparing the short-term dollars with the long-term dollars and really being able to sell that, like, honestly, that would be huge. You know, and then it's the data access, right? And we're a small staff, everybody's, you know, time crunched. So being able to pull those numbers down specific to our state and share those on a regular basis would be amazing.
Can I just add a plug for that, Julie? Because I think that's such a good point. Like, national tools that can be customized to a state or a jurisdiction in a way that's like, that's meaningful, that really drills down onto the details is really helpful. And we don't see a lot of that probably because it's hard to do, but when we do see them, they're really great. So I would second that.
I'll say this is very timely with a lot of the updates we're doing to our portfolio at DOE around, you know, the themes you each have shared across, you know, best, you know, solutions around value stacking or braiding funding, our Buildings Upgrade Prize, looking for innovations across the country of new ways to do that. Quantifying the value proposition and not just energy and emissions, and the whole world of tools that can be customized, and how do we do that? You know, what's most efficiently done nationally, but then can be really leveraged and meaningful to you. Around, we've been partnering with Energy Star about messaging resources that can be useful to each of you, again, to be customized. And then the boring building field validation, Nick, is going to be, I love that frame. And the last NASEO meeting, I talked a bit about our new work, or as did Alejandro Moreno, around our new work on grid edge integration and supercharging, DOE's investment and support of state energy office, public utility commissions, utilities. And for the first time, we did a joint NOI for our competitions that went across transportation, office electricity, renewable energy sectors, and buildings. You all live at that intersection. The fact that it took DOE that long to get to the point where we could show that we're doing that all together. But it's exciting that we're finally there, and around doing exactly what you both have just said. How do we de-risk, and whatever version de-risking needs to be? Maybe that's making sure that there's one nearby that people can travel to and touch. Maybe that means collecting the right data or doing it in these different building subtypes. So we're all humans in all of this. And so I really appreciate that perspective of there's no right or wrong. It's what are the actors that we're trying to help create change? What do they need? And that's going to look different in different parts of the country. It's going to look different in different elements of change you're working on. And we really welcome that feedback. We take the word innovation to be a much broader word now than just, one narrow perspective from a technology priority. So please, this is awesome. I want this conversation to go on for 2 more hours. We've got so many more questions to pick on that. So thank you for sharing those reflections. And for everyone on the call, please keep those perspectives coming. One comment though, before I hand it to Julie, I think, to ask the next question. I was remiss, one comment I should have said at the outset, this blueprint came out of DOE because it's easier to get documents out of a single agency, but you should know this was a really close collaboration with our colleagues at HUD, at EPA, at CEQ, and the White House. And so this really is seen as an olive federal approach. So don't be shy with feedback that, oh, well, is this really resonant for EERE? You shouldn't have to figure that out. We'll make it work on the back end across federal government. Any idea or question is really welcome.
Awesome, that's great. All right, so next question is, what are some of the ways you all are incorporating equity considerations into your work?
All right, you want to go, Carolyn, or you want me to start?
You should start.
Okay, all right. I'll throw out a few, but I'm genuinely excited to hear what everyone else has to say, including the folks joining us for the session. So we have a few things that we are doing in the district that I think are helping us incorporate equity into our work. One of them is a tool that the district has developed, that our agency has developed, called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment. So this is a formalized process where you take a program team, either that's been running a program for a while, that's starting a new program, and you sit down and you go through a series of questions and prompts as a group that kind of help you think through the program's design and impacts and how it is or could be made more sensitive to racial equity and to other types of related equities. And we just actually completed this process for our, we're about to submit our home energy efficiency rebate application. And so we went through this for that application and sort of the ultimate program design that we're developing. And I think it was really helpful in highlighting some of the things to give us a little bit of credit, like that we had done well in designing our approach to those rebate dollars, but also a bunch of things that we hadn't thought through as well. And including things like, what stakeholder groups have we reached out to and who haven't we reached out to? And what is our plan to engage, different specific communities and the stakeholder groups that are within them? So I think that tool, that approach is very valuable. It kind of pairs with some work that we're doing around equitable electrification. So we have a grant out right now to work with a grantee to do an equitable electrification study that helps us think about how, as a district, we are both mitigating and adapting to climate change in an equitable way by working with district residents to help influence our programs, our electrification and decarbonization programs and policies. A very simple one, but that I'm proud of, is that we really take a near 100% focus on low-income households through our programs, including through major federal programs. So that's through both of the federal rebate programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. It's also through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Solar for All program. We are channeling most, if not all, of those benefits to 80% AMI households or below. Now, 80% AMI in the district is quite a lot of money, let's be honest, but it still constitutes the least advantaged residents of DC and the folks that we know are going to have the hardest time making the kinds of investments that align so closely with the blueprint. And then working with our partners, for instance, the Institute for Market Transformation, on other federal funding, such as the RECI funds, to do an equity assessment of the BEPS program I mentioned earlier, our Building Performance Standards program, so that we have an approach to that program as we work to improve at an ongoing basis, where we take community input and integrate it better into our decision-making process as we do things like move to a greenhouse gas emissions standard for that program. So those are some of the things we're doing.
That's an exciting portfolio, Nick. And that's just some of them. It's wonderful, wonderful leadership. A lot to build from. A few things I would share from a DOE perspective, that we are really doing things differently than we did a few years ago. You all are very well aware, so I will not go into the insides and outsides of the IRA and bill programs, but it's remarkable the focus that Congress did place on low-income and moderate-income families and communities in that. At the buildings office at DOE, already through the process of developing this blueprint, it really, our undersecretary said this last week at the HUD Innovation Showcase, that it's flipped our R&D model on its head. We now start from a prioritization perspective of the most underserved and overburdened communities. And so that means an R&D focus that's looking at what you all know are really hard retrofit solutions sometimes. How are we looking at the health and safety challenges? I first learned about buildings through a state weatherization assistance program. So I'm very aware of all the challenges, from space constraints, occupant challenges. When you're talking about affordable housing, what are you doing? How are you making sure this is an experience that works for the residents? How are we looking at the space constraints and other constraints in multifamily and manufactured housing applications in much older buildings? So you'll see that in our R&D competitions, that through our benefit FOA, in our Easy Prize. It's about finding easier ways to do affordable electrification retrofits. In our recent Commercial Envelope Prize and Accelerator on commercial heat pump solution, that's not just for Class A office buildings, and work on our cold climate heat pump challenge as well. So across our portfolio, and that's, it's not just a conversation from our R&D, although we really are pivoting our R&D focus. It's also in how we've updated our analysis to really be transparent on low-income impacts of our standards rules, and looking at our building codes work and making sure that that's working for communities across our country. I also will do a quick shout out. I briefly mentioned this earlier, and Jared pointed to it as well, but our affordable home energy shot was the final energy earth shot announced by the administration. And it's one that many administration officials have said in very public settings, to not quote them, but it's their favorite earth shot. And you can see why, because buildings are so important. And it's also our first earth shot that was done in partnership with our Equity and Environmental Justice Office. And from the beginning was a prompt, not just of what technologies do we need in buildings, but what would it mean to do an equity focused earth shot? And the goal is to reduce the upfront cost of upgrading a home by at least 50%, while also reducing the energy bills by 20% within a decade. We've heard from many of you that those are incredibly ambitious goals. We've heard from others, they're not ambitious enough to make it pencil where we need to in many of these situations. There's been robust conversations about technologies under that goal, but also workforce and other market challenges. So thank you for your robust engagement in that conversation. Several of you were part of our summit that we had on that just last week. But there's so much more work to do there. And we're really excited about the close partnership with HUD. We've mentioned several DOE funding sources, but as you all are well aware with braiding, how do we best leverage HUD funding as well as EPA funding and others to achieve your important goals in buildings? And then while I have the floor, I'll quickly follow up on Rodney's question that he put in the chat. Yes, Rodney, that we are really leveraging the blueprint to challenge all investments across the federal family. Are we really leading by example? When we say we're doing federal leading by example, how are we maximizing the use of our own federal footprint to, and again, to quote, to be validating and boring buildings, the things that will, enable these technologies to rapidly take off. And with the question on what's next for connected communities, we called it out on our NOI that a new FOA is coming soon. And it's been great how much we're learning already from the current first cohort of projects. But Julie, I'm sure you have more to share as well on all the leadership you've had on your equity portfolio in Michigan.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we're looking at, I know with the federal, funding that there's the requirement for the 40%. Well, we're looking at dedicating 100% of our funding to our disadvantaged communities and those equity areas in the state, just because, a lot of these areas don't have the resources that other advantaged areas do. So dedicating 100% of the funding allows us to really make an impact in those areas that need it the most. And this is, mostly in our home energy rebate program, but we include it as options within all of our other funding opportunities. And we actually just announced we have a Justice 40 technical assistance program that just opened up that's supposed to provide support for Justice 40 communities that's looking at bringing in investments to those overburdened and underserved communities, focused on really reducing pollution, creating jobs, and improving public health and the quality of life. While also advancing clean energy and resilience and building stronger organizations, right? To build capacity, connecting community-based clean energy and climate projects through funding to make a bigger impact. And really looking at the big picture and for the long haul.
Great. Julie, before I come back to you with the last question, Carolyn, I just wanted to say two things in response to what you were discussing a moment ago, which is one, I'm really excited by the affordable home Earthshot. Like I felt for a long time that we as a nation and as government spend a lot of time thinking about how do we build affordable housing. And we spend a lot of time and money thinking about how do we build efficient housing, but we very rarely talk about both in the same breath. And I think it sort of shows and that there aren't the same, and I'm sure someone's gonna put in the chat that I'm leaving out some really critical research think tank, but you don't see in my mind a lot of kind of concerted research dollars, demonstration dollars going into that joint space. And I think that's really critical because the efficiency piece, obviously, as you said, should matter so much more in some ways in that affordable home space, because it's about not only the upfront cost, but also sort of smoothing and reducing those ongoing costs that sort of, a surprise $350 electric bill or gas bill to a household is a really big deal if your income is constrained. So that was one thing I'm really excited, and I'm looking forward to see where that initiative goes. And then I just would say, I think that the federal government, we have a lot of federal buildings in the district. And so we get to see the kinds of investments the federal government's making up close and personal. And I'm really excited to see some of what GSA is doing, both in terms of things like coming up with a very concrete plan to draw down the gas-powered steam distribution system that powers a lot of federal buildings and a couple of district buildings, but even some really innovative thinking I see happening within GSA about sort of deep energy retrofits for existing buildings. Some of them are almost as boring as the ones that I want to see done. So, okay, maybe we'll move to our last question. So, Julie, back to you. To what extent are you thinking about health and resilience impacts in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think this is, the interesting connection. A lot of the times in the work we do, right, it's focused just on energy efficiency, renewable energy, but it's the corresponding impacts that has on our health, right? When we have buildings that are more energy efficient, right? And we've addressed some of those health and safety issues in the home or in the building, right? Because we can't do the energy efficiency upgrades until those are done first, right? The quality of the air is better. The comfort temperature of the home is better. You're not finding the mold issues that are in there, right? When you have a building that's actually efficient and running the way it should, your overall health is just better. And then the corresponding ripple effects that go with that, right? When we have buildings that are drawing less from the grid is needing less energy from the corresponding areas. We're able to add energy or add electrification projects on because we can add in the EV chargers, right? So then you're having that ripple effect on the transportation side too, which is having not just the building, but it's also the outdoor air quality as well. You know, and when we have people that have less stress because they're not as worried about, you know, their health inside the building and they don't have to dedicate all their funding to their energy bill, right? They can use that to improve other areas in terms of food security, in terms of, you know, other areas of their life. So we're kind of looking at like the big picture and the bigger scale of how it all interplays and relates to each other. And then, you know, and the other thing too is weather's crazy in this time and place, right? So having a building that can withstand not only the, you know, the temperature changes that are happening all the time, but also incorporating that renewable energy, the storage capability, so that when we do have those crazy, you know, crazy storms that come through, the building can still have power, right? Which still gives access to water, which still gives access to heat or cool, depending on how hot it is, you know, so that they can withstand some of those power outages that roll through.
Carolyn, what's your all's approach on this?
Yes to everything Julie just said. And one of my big priorities for the coming year, and so welcome everyone's feedback on this, is how do we help make what Julie just said a reality? Like, how do we quantify in a way that's a good enough quantification that you actually can include that in that really hard value stack that you both are trying to build? How do we support integrated planning that isn't missing some of those huge chunks that Julie just talked about because of an arbitrary silo barrier? You know, my quantitative training was going like, oh, how do we're not quantifying all the costs, you know, the co-benefits is how EPA would say it, right? But it's so much more than that. And it goes back to the conversation around, you know, do you have the right communication tools that you all need? I go back to Energy Star. It taught me so much about human behavior. And sometimes it's the numbers and the hard, you know, value prop. And sometimes it's other things that gets us all, you know, inspired and helps enable the change we need. So how are we providing that and marshaling the full national lab and academic structure across our country to get good enough numbers so that you can have a structure that brings people along? Because we can have this entire conversation and almost the entire blueprint and never talk about greenhouse gases or climate change as our priority, right? We don't need to have that be a shared policy priority to talk about the energy insecurity issues, to talk about everyone wants to have clean air and clean water in their home and around their home and where they work, to talk about our energy goals, to talk about the national security implications of the supply chains associated with everything that all the different threads of what we just talked about, and on the workforce implications. So we have not done a good enough job at having the analytics and data and stories for you to draw from. So challenge us, call us to task on that, tell us what you need as we start to roll out our best versions of that. Tell us how it could be even better, because to me, it's a huge gap that I think we could be more helpful than we are. It's hard to do, right? I'm not trying to, there's a reason, right? It's hard science, but by having no answer, that's a zero, right? So let's get a good enough answer that's meaningful to your work. And last piece I'll say, because I know many of you are part of this work, folding in the resilience conversation as well and into our building codes program that's focused on not just energy efficiency, but explicitly on the resilience elements and what are good quantification metrics. And, you know, I came from predicting extreme events as part of climate change in my academic background. And it's hard. And as Julie said, the world's rapidly evolving. You don't need to agree on greenhouse gas targets, but we do need to address the natural disasters we're facing and how to make our buildings more resilient and how to make our communities more resilient. And again, I think DOE wants to be a much stronger partner in that, and one that, you know, really is relevant in all the states across our country. So yes to everything Julie said.
So Carolyn, just to build on a couple of points you made. So so fellow researcher and me in terms of my previous work, have the same instincts. And so one of the things that we've been working on, I mean, basically since I got to the agency a couple of years ago, is how can we quantify, again, not just the energy savings, like that's important, but that's to me, and it's always like, I don't know what the right analogy is or whatever, but it's like a three-legged stool, right? It's like energy savings, health, and comfort. And in that order, the things get, I would argue, like harder to quantify, but maybe more important, right? Like households, I don't want to say they don't care about energy savings, but it's not their top priority. And we know that, right? Households care quite a bit more about health, but they tend to experience that in sort of like challenging and intermittent ways, right? They have a child that develops asthma, the child gets hospitalized. That's horrible. But then they can control it maybe through an inhaler, right? And then they have comfort, and comfort is the thing they experience every day. And like Julie, you mentioned this, right? People just feeling better in their homes, like, but that's the hardest to quantify. Like, I'm an economist. I do not have good tools to reliably quantify comfort. Like, we can do it, but I think we have to work on it. So I think one thing, as you all at the federal level are thinking about this from a measurement and research perspective, I think would be, I think it would be valuable for each jurisdiction, let's say each state in the context of NASEO, to, if there was a way to have partners at the federal level that have that kind of research capacity that state energy offices don't have, to go out and do that measurement. Because, you know, I know that if we have a really good analytic effort up in New York or in Michigan or in California, I can transfer those benefits pretty well. But people who, you know, the households in the District of Columbia, the legislators of the District of Columbia, that's harder for them to do. But when they see that someone went out and measured 100 households in a particularly disadvantaged part of our city, and they came back and showed that, you know, through a federal rebate program, we improved like hospitalization outcomes for children with asthma, or just, you know, even if it's just self-measured, like comfort at home, like that's really meaningful. And I think maybe that's where the federal government could have an important role, is to help provide some of that like centralized analytic oomph to, you know, a distributed set of states, so that everyone has that information at hand. It's a bit, I think, of what we were talking about a bit ago with like taking those national tools and bringing them down to the local level.
Yeah, just for an example, so one of the things that we did we participated in Celica, the Clean Energy for Low-Income Community Accelerator program, right? After we participated in the accelerator, we kind of continued it on for additional phases. And one of the things that we implemented was a pre and a post survey. So we interviewed, you know, the participants before they got the weatherization, before they got the low-income community solar credits, with a, you know, a barrage of questions. And of course, it's a small group. We're talking like 25, 50, you know, households. Asking questions like, you know, how do you feel in your home? How many times do you go to the ER? What kind of health issues? You know, things like that. And then we asked them afterward, you know, 6 months to a year afterward, and we saw across the board, you know, their number of ER visits went down, their comfort in the home went up, you know, they were making their bill payments on time. But coming up with that survey question and making sure, you know, we weren't leading the questions, you know, so having like a barrage of questions that we could put into a survey that we could, you know, put out in the field, that would be helpful as well.
Well, what a great way the three of you capped off this discussion. I think the comments around the bigger picture health and quantification and a lot of things came to mind. And I was thinking in particular, Nick, with your comments around, you know, every jurisdiction, state, district are so different, and the number of people in the district that are impacted by buildings in particular relative to, you know, other jurisdictions, and the kind of analytical and communications work that needs to be done. And I also just think about the very qualitative responses that we have had in talking with states that have talked to their constituents and hear back how they're doing. And not only the health benefits, which are obvious but need to be quantified, but just the economic benefits of having people in a place that they're healthy enough, well enough that they can work, do whatever they need to do, whatever they're able to do, is enormous. There's a big story here, and I don't want to lose track of just letting people tell that very people-focused story where we started with the blueprint. It is the people-focused part of this really comes through, whether that is a resident of an affordable housing community or whether it's a small business and what have you. I think it's a wider range of audience, and really that pragmatic sort of place you took us, Carolyn. I love that. That's somebody who has had the experience that you've had. So really terrific. Well, we've had a lot of questions and comments that we've addressed in the chat, but I want to ask Jasmine if we missed any particular questions. It looks like we have answered them all based on what I see in the chat. Any final comments before we wrap up from either the three of you?
David, I'll jump in just with, again, thank you. Nick and Julie, this was such a vibrant discussion in like only a few minutes. So for those of you who are listening in who have additional thoughts, do not be shy. This was exactly the kind of discussion we have. And David, thank you for your leadership and for convening this discussion. I couldn't imagine a better illustration of what we're hoping to have happen from the blueprint. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Julie or Nick, any other final comments?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Carolyn and Jared, and Nick, this was a great conversation. I feel like this is a really exciting time to be in this space. 2030 sounds far away, but it's only 6 years, so 5.5. So like having this momentum is pretty powerful, and it feels, like in this space, we actually get to see some of the change that we're putting in place. So it's a really exciting time. So thanks for your hard work, and I look forward to all the other work that we get to do together.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to restate that because you all said it better than I could, but I'll just say, David, you heard me make this point to you before, which is, I think some of the real benefits the biggest benefit to me of sort of coming together through NASEO is being able to hear what other states or our partners at the federal government are doing in the concrete ways, exactly the things we talked about today. Like, what is Julie doing on the ground in Michigan? What are the specific programs that Carolyn's coordinating through the national labs and others? So I appreciate that opportunity, and I appreciate everyone joining us here today.
Same here, and it is hearing from all of you is what energizes me every day and gives me the best job I know of, because if I'm having a little off day, I kind of look out to people like you that I know, and Carolyn and Jared as well for joining us, and you really get revived. So thanks very much, and thanks to Jasmine for helping arrange all of this. And we'll conclude here. Please do send any follow-up questions you may have. The slides will be available, and I'm sure we'll continue this discussion at the annual meeting as well, coming up this fall. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.